I'm Bob Canary, and I'd like to introduce you to Sara Teasdale, and particularly the love poems of Sara Teasdale. But I thought I'd begin by giving away the ending. It's not a happy ending. In 1933, Sara Teasdale committed suicide. Now, back in 1918, she had won what is now called the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, and she had remained about as popular as serious poets get. But fame, as we like to hear, does not mean happiness, and she couldn't bear to go on living. And these days, Teasdale and her poetry are almost forgotten. The best anthology on my bookshelves is the Oxford Book of American Poetry. It's huge, but my copy doesn't include even one poem by Sara Teasdale in its 1,100 plus pages. So if you've never heard of her, you have plenty of company. And posterity can be hard on minor poets. Being admired during one's lifetime is no guarantee of posthumous respect. But many forgotten minor poets are still worth looking at. I may be especially inclined to feel that way about Sara Teasdale because she was one of my parents' favorite poets. On our bookshelves were 2 slim volumes of her verse, one which my mother apparently bought or was given when she was a teenager, and another which my father gave her in 1933. I know that because it comes with a little poem he wrote to her on the flyleaf. It was a love gift because Sara Teasdale's reputation was based on her love poems. Strangely enough, though, the one poem by Sara Teasdale which has had a sort of afterlife is not a love poem. That poem is There Will Come Soft Rains. If you've encountered it, it might be through an oft-reprinted short story by Ray Bradbury. That story is also entitled There Will Come Soft Rains, and it's included in his book, The Martian Chronicles. Or you might have come across it in Fallout 3. The third installment of a popular video game. Now, both the story and the game are set in landscapes devastated by nuclear blasts, and in both, the poem is recited by a robotic voice. Now, the robots are in better voice than I am these days, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. There will come soft rains, and the smell of the ground, and swallows circling with their shimmering sound, and frogs in the pools singing at night, and wild plum trees in tremulous white. Robins will wear their feathery fire, whistling their whims on a low fence wire, and not one will know of the war, not one will care at last when it is done. Not one would mind, neither bird nor tree, if mankind perished utterly. And spring herself, when she woke at dawn, would scarcely know that we were gone. Now this starts out as a harmless nature poem, and you might expect it to turn into a poem of reassurance in time of war. Don't worry, spring is always on its way, blah, blah, blah. Instead, it goes on to remind us that nature doesn't care about our efforts to destroy ourselves. Now, the poem was written after some particularly bloody battles in World War I, but you can see why it might appeal to people these days when we all face the threat of nuclear annihilation. But most of Sara Teasdale's best early poems are about the vicissitudes of love, reflecting her not entirely satisfying romantic life. She had a bad habit of falling in love with poets, though there was also a shipboard romance with a young English dilettante. Now, the first of the poets was a young stockbroker and poet, John Myers O'Hara. O'Hara is the man she speaks of in her poem Union Square. While she was still at home in St. Louis, Teasdale wrote O'Hara to express her appreciation of his poetry, and they began a correspondence. in the course of which she became convinced that she was in love with him. And after Teasdale arrived in New York, O'Hara did write her poems and took her for long walks in the city. Union Square is the neighborhood around the junction of Broadway and what is now Fourth Avenue, and it is at the heart of the city. Now here's the poem. With the man I love who loves me not, I walked in the street lamp's flare. We watched the world go home that night in a flood through Union Square. I leaned to catch the words he said that were light as a snowflake falling. Ah, well that he never leaned to hear the words my heart was calling. And on we walked, past the fiery lights of the picture shows, where the girls with thirsty eyes go by on the errand each man knows. And on we walked, at the door at last we said goodbye. I knew by his smile he had not heard my heart's unuttered cry. With the man I love, who loves me not, I walked in the street lamp's flare. But oh, the girls who ask for love in the lights of Union Square. The man is too preoccupied with his own words to sense Teasdale's longing. And the last stanza makes it clear that this was at least partly a sexual longing. The girls are bold and ask for love, but Teasdale lacks the courage to do so. Envying these ladies was a bit daring for 1911, and Teasdale was nervous about it. She had to be talked out of changing the sense completely before publishing it, or not publishing the poem at all. And the poem did, in fact, create a bit of a stir when it appeared. And yet the poem also suggests Teasdale's ambivalence about her own urges. After all, the girls who ask for love are presumably prostitutes, and it is well that the man never hears her unvoiced longings. The limits of Teasdale's daring are particularly apparent when one compares her with two other poets from my parents' bookshelves, Eleanor Wiley and Edna St. Vincent Millay. Wiley and Millay are not that much younger than Teasdale, who was born in 1884. But they belonged to the Roaring Twenties, in a way Teasdale did not, even though she was still popular then. Millay's first book of poetry was published in 1920, Wiley's in 1921, not counting an earlier anonymous leaflet. The book of poems Teasdale published in 1920, Flame and Shadow, was her fifth. Neither Wiley nor Millay was much inclined to repress desire. Millay wrote this little poem of defiance. My candle burns at both ends, it will not last the night. But ah, my foes, and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light. The multiple marriages and affairs of Wiley and Millay even scandalized many of their contemporaries, and they would have been inconceivable for Sara Teasdale. Quite aside from the difference in generations, neither Wiley nor Millay had a mother quite like Sara Teasdale's. Teasdale's father was 45 when she was born, and was said to be more like an indulgent grandfather to her than a father. Her mother was 40, but dynamic, strong-minded, overprotective, and the dominant member of the family, as she had strict and rather Victorian beliefs about proper behavior, and she raised Teasdale accordingly. Teasdale was coddled, treated as sickly, and raised with as little contact with other children as possible. There's a warning here. Homeschooling your child may lead to their becoming a poet. Now, actually, Sara Teasdale's parents encouraged her poetic ambitions, and they eventually paid for this. Sara Teasdale's first book of poems in 1907 is shown on the screen. Even so, as a young adult, Teasdale felt stifled at home, particularly by her mother. And a few years after that publication, Teasdale finally escaped to New York. But she never really escaped the influence of her upbringing. Of course, which of us really does? In the end, for example, she married the sort of man her parents could approve of, a well-to-do businessman. Till then, there were poets. After John Myers O'Hara, there was John Hall Wheelock. As with O'Hara, this began when Teasdale wrote Wheelock, expressing enthusiasm for his poetry. Wheelock enjoyed her company and her sponsorship, for by then she was far more well known as a poet than he was. But it never developed into the kind of relationship Teasdale was hoping for. Somehow Wheelock didn't get around to telling her that he had long been in love with another woman. The next poet, in a more serious case, was Vachel Lindsay. Lindsay was a bardic poet in the vernacular tradition of Walt Whitman. His poems were meant to be chanted, and he later toured performing them himself. He's fairly obscure today, but in my long-ago youth, his poems were still used for dramatic recitations. Now, as you might expect, his poetry is very different from Teasdale's. Lindsay's best-known poem may well be The Congo, a well-intentioned tribute to African Americans, and now regarded as too full of racial stereotypes. So to give you something of the flavor of his work, let me quote from the beginning of General William Booth Enters into Heaven, a tribute to the founder of the Salvation Army. It comes complete with directions indicating it is to be sung to the tune of the Blood of the Lamb and accompanied with banjos, tambourines, flute, and a big bass drum. Booth is leading a procession of more or less reformed sinners. Booth led boldly with his big bass drum. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? The saints smiled gravely and they said, He's come. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Walking lepers followed rank on rank, lurching bravos from the ditches dank, drabs from the alleyways and drug fiends pale, minds still passion-ridden, soul powers frail. Lindsay genuinely loved Teasdale. Unfortunately, he was chronically broke. And in the meantime, she was being doggedly pursued by a far more conventional suitor, Ernst Filsinger. Now, Filsinger also genuinely loved Teasdale. She was less sure she could love Filsinger, but eventually decided that she did, prudently choosing the well-off Filsinger over the impecunious Lindsay. Lindsay accused her of playing it safe and trying to avoid the price of being a poet. Poverty, presumably. Teasdale herself was at least ambivalent. Here's a poem she wrote soon after her engagement and did not publish during her marriage to Filsinger. It's called Dreams. I gave my life to another lover. I gave my love and all. But over a dream the past will hover. Out of a dream the past will call. I tear myself from sleep with a shiver. But on my breast a kiss is hot, and by my bed the ghostly giver is waiting, though I see him not. Lindsay is the ghostly giver of the dream kiss in this poem. Late in life, by the way, Teasdale did renew her friendship with Lindsay, who was, however, by that time safely married. And her last volume, published in 1933, includes an elegy to his memory. Now, Filsinger does not seem to have been the kind of man to inspire dreams that would make Teasdale awake with a shiver. That seems possibly clear from a poem that Teasdale did publish just a year after her marriage. I am not yours, not lost in you, not lost, although I long to be lost as a candle lit at noon, lost as a snowflake in the sea. You love me, and I find you still a spirit beautiful and bright. Yet I am I, who long to be lost as a light is lost in light. Oh, plunge me deep in love, put out my senses, leave me deaf and blind, swept by the tempest of your love, a taper in a rushing wind. As a poem by a newlywed, that does not sound especially promising. Even so, the first years of Teasdale's marriage to Filsinger may well have been happy ones. The book she published in 1920, Flame and Shadow, is full of love poems to her husband. I don't think much of them, but you can judge for yourself. At least here's one of them. In Warsaw, in Poland, half the world away, the one I love best of all thought of me today. I know, for I went winged as a bird. In the wide flowing wind his own voice I heard. His arms were round me in a ferny place. I looked to the pool, and there was his face. But now it is night, and the cold stars say, Warsaw in Poland is half the world away. Well, back in real life, Filsinger's frequent trips on business were more painful for Teasdale than that poem may suggest. They seem to have left Teasdale feeling abandoned and depressed, and her feelings of loneliness and depression are addressed in Alone, a poem rather unlike most of the poems in Flame and Shadow. I am alone, in spite of love, in spite of all I take and give, in spite of all your tenderness. Sometimes I am not glad to live. I am alone, as though I stood on the highest peak of the tired gray world. About me only swirling snow, above me endless space unfurled, with earth hidden and heaven hidden, and only my own spirit's pride to keep me from the peace of those who are not lonely, having died. Teasdale was still able to stave off such suicidal thoughts, but she was growing out of love with Filsinger. And in 1929, Teasdale shocked her husband by divorcing him. Evidently, she only notified him at the last minute because her lawyers insisted. But of course, the failure of their marriage then contributed to her deepening depression. Her later work is mostly nature poems and poems of memory, viewing her past more with nostalgia than with regret. She presents herself as having given up passion. She is now the wise woman. She must be rich who can forego an hour so bejeweled with delight. She must have treasuries of joy that she can draw on day and night. She must be very sure of heaven. Or is it only that she feels how much more safe it is to lack a thing that time so often steals? Well, she could not maintain such serenity. As she neared the end of her 40s, she experienced financial difficulties and ill health, eventually becoming convinced that she was doomed to suffer a debilitating stroke at any moment. On the morning of January 29, 1933, she was found dead in her bathtub. Her sister got an accommodating medical examiner to call it an accident, but Teasdale had been discussing suicide in recent days and had taken a heavy dose of barbiturates before getting in the tub. and those facts soon became public knowledge. Sara Teasdale had finally sought the peace of those who are not lonely, being dead. Now, if you'd like to read some more of Sara Teasdale's poems for yourself, the magic of the digital age means that you can still get most of her poetry on the net in one form or another. If you would like to know more about her life and loves, as I speak, William Drake's 1989 biography is still available on Amazon as a paperback. Now, either route is likely to be more useful than asking me, but I certainly welcome any comments or questions. I'm Bob Canary. I'm a professor emeritus of English at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, and my email address is canary@uwp.edu. Thanks for listening.